And now I would like to announce our new talk. And these are Françoise Despalles and Johannes Strugalla, excuse me. I would like to introduce them because they are dealing with the topic of artists' books and printing in the Édition Despalles located at Mainz and Paris. And it belongs to the best known addresses in Europe for printing and books, as I already said. In the 70s and early 80s, they have printed handset poems on posters and developed a high range of experimental typography. They have started an everlasting program of limited artist books editions, and they have always been involving in the two languages of German and French, and they mostly did this in collaboration with a third artist on top, I would say. Their masterpieces, their books are masterpieces in conception and in print quality. The development of printing techniques is mirrored significantly in their work over decades. Please pay attention to the presentation of Johannes Strugalla and Françoise Despalles. They'll speak in English and in French.
Bonjour à tous. Et Stéphane, une fois encore merci. Et merci à toute la super équipe de Klingspor. Dans un an tout juste, les éditions Despalles entreront dans leur 40e année. Tout d'abord, laissez-moi préciser, quand je dis nous, il s'agit de Johannes et de moi-même, car si les éditions portent mon nom, Johannes en est le créateur, le concepteur, le véritable moteur. Évoquer nos origines permet peut-être de mieux comprendre l'évolution et l'originalité de notre parcours d'imprimeur-éditeur. Si Johannes est allemand, moi-même, je suis française et parisienne de surcroît. Dès le commencement, au début des années 80, nos éditions mettent donc un pied en Allemagne, plus précisément à Mayence, et un pied à Paris. Ce balancement d'un pied sur l'autre, ce va-et-vient d'un lieu à l'autre, se poursuivra tout au long de notre parcours et en sera une des particularités. Mais dès le départ, nous choisirons Mayence comme site principal de vie et lieu de travail. Le contexte culturel, politique, social de notre environnement jouant bien sûr un rôle primordial, nous nous sommes intéressés très tôt aux activités du musée Gutenberg. En 1982, la direction du musée nous propose d'organiser une exposition d'artistes contemporains pratiquant en France diverses formes d'impression taille douce. Artiste plasticien, Johannes Strugalla ayant étudié aux Beaux-Arts de Paris dans un atelier de gravure, il lui fut donc aisé d'inviter 5 artistes déjà reconnus pour leur qualité en eau-forte, aquatin, pointe sèche, mezzo tinto, etc. En parallèle, nous présentons à l'Institut français le travail d'une galerie spécialisée en gravure, la galerie Michel Bouta, avec laquelle nous collaborions depuis des années. Nous avons eu la chance unique de vivre une époque révolutionnaire qui, de façon déterminante, allait orienter notre activité future. C'est en effet dans les années 80 que les imprimeurs abandonnèrent le plomb pour passer en photocomposition. De merveilleux ateliers étaient en train de disparaître. Nous nous apercevons alors que le musée Gutenberg, par manque de place peut-être, négligeait les propositions d'imprimeurs, obligés, s'ils ne trouvaient pas acquéreurs, de se débarrasser de leur matériel typographique à l'ancienne. Depuis longtemps, Johannes, écrivant lui-même, s'intéressait non seulement au texte, mais avait eu également l'occasion de travailler souvent avec des imprimeurs en France comme en Allemagne. À Mayence, pour tirer les gravures sur bois, une presse à épreuve venait tout juste d'intégrer notre gamme. Texte et bois gravés pouvant s'imprimer sur le même support, il nous restait donc seulement à acquérir le matériel typographique nécessaire. Or, ce matériau, toujours réutilisable, pouvant se prêter à toute fantaisie créatrice, se trouvait soudain abordable et disponible. L'abondance du matériel proposé fut telle que la Volkshochschule, l'université populaire de Mayence, s'y intéressa et proposa à Johannes Strugalla d'organiser un atelier d'imprimerie ouvert à tous dans une ancienne tuilerie de la ville. Fut ainsi créé le premier Druckladen de Mayence, où chacun pourrait s'initier à l'imprimerie en tirant cartes de vœux, poèmes, invitations, etc. Ce projet connut un grand succès. Les années 80 furent aussi celles d'un engagement politique particulier contre les Croisimusees, contre les Pershing, débarqués en Allemagne. Un important mouvement pour la paix, la Friedensbewegung, s'est rapidement organisé. Les manifestations de solidarité se multipliant, nous avons été amenés de plus en plus à réaliser des affiches. Des casses disparates provenant de différentes imprimeries s'accumulaient dans notre cave, transformées en atelier, ce qui nous entraîna vers une utilisation simultanée des caractères et une mise en page typographique proche du dadaïsme. C'est en joignant le bois gravé au caractère plomb ou bois que sont nées les premières affiches poèmes, avec pour la plupart un texte allemand. Plusieurs séries se distinguent selon la nature de leurs propos, leur origine, leur style. Parmi elles, les malgré tout, exprimant pour la plupart une réaction face à des actualités intolérables. Erich Fried en fut l'un des auteurs privilégiés. Ces affiches étaient dédiées à Rab Krisaba, qui affirmait un engagement social et politique à travers les affiches en bois gravé. Citons également les Mainz Plakatgedicht, affiches éditées en collaboration avec la ville de Mayence et placardées sur les colonnes maurice de la ville, qui présentaient chacune un poème de l'écrivain ou écrivaine publique de l'année en résidence au musée Gutenberg. Importante également les Festa Typographica, inspirées par les textes d'auteurs de poésie visuelle, concrète, surréaliste. Ceux-ci ont contribué à avoir une place prépondérante dans notre travail. 35 de ces 38 affiches furent conçues, réalisées et imprimées dans notre atelier par Johannes entre 1983 et 1993. Peu à peu, les textes proposés augmentèrent, mais leur nature ne pouvait pas toujours se prêter au cadre des affiches. À partir de 1983, nous avons acquis suffisamment de caractères de même corps pour composer et imprimer des textes de plus grande envergure. Cet état de fait nous amène donc à passer de la fiche poème au livre. Mais qu'est-ce qu'un éditeur de livres d'artistes? Comment définir ce rôle à cette époque? Dans les années 80, les éditeurs tels que Theriad, Kahnweiler et Memacht n'existaient pour ainsi dire plus. Ceux-ci finançaient chacun des projets qu'ils voulaient éditer en choisissant l'écrivain, l'artiste, le typographe qui l'exécuterait. Mais l'éditeur des années 70-80 est lui-même l'artiste et l'artisan de son projet. Le livre devient totalement ou en partie le support de son œuvre artistique. Il n'est plus celui qui finance un projet extérieur, mais celui qui conçoit, réalise et imprime chaque étape de ce livre seul ou en collaboration avec un autre artiste, un autre écrivain. La configuration de nos éditions, notre situation géographique, nous a naturellement fait opter pour la réalisation d'un livre artiste bilingue, avec si possible des textes inédits pour les auteurs contemporains, accompagnés d'une traduction chaque fois originale, tout en privilégiant une rencontre entre un auteur et un artiste connu dans un pays et ignoré dans l'autre, comme par exemple Friederike Mayröcker, Robert Schwarz en Allemagne et Antonin Artaud et Monique Friedman en France. Mais comment se faire connaître? Comment diffuser ces ouvrages? C'est à Mayence même que nous avons trouvé un début de réponse en rencontrant nos premiers collègues lors du Salon des petits éditeurs. Depuis les années 70, la Mainz Mini Pressemesse regroupe pendant 4 jours tous les 2 ans jusqu'à 350 éditions. Longtemps, elle eut lieu sous tente au bord du Rhin. Nous y avons participé plusieurs années. À l'époque, les Handpressen, éditeurs-imprimeurs, y étaient peu représentés. L'équipe d'organisation nous ayant rapidement intégrés avec nos collègues et amis Uta Schneider et Ulrike Stolz, nous avons pu opter pour une ouverture européenne du salon et commencer par inviter des collègues français. C'est toutefois à Francfort que nos éditions prirent leur véritable envol. Chaque année a lieu la Foire internationale du livre. La proximité de cette ville nous a permis de nous y rendre régulièrement et là de découvrir qu'un certain nombre d'artistes comme nous, imprimeurs, éditeurs, pouvaient exposer leur travail sur un stand pour un prix relativement modique. À partir de 82, nous avons donc 36 ans durant exposé nos ouvrages à la Foire du livre de Francfort. Rapidement sollicités pour participer à d'autres salons, à d'autres manifestations, aussi bien en Allemagne qu'en France, en Suisse, plus tard aux États-Unis, principalement à Codex, Biennale de San Francisco, nous avons continué à rencontrer d'autres artistes, d'autres éditeurs proches de notre pratique de l'édition. Certains parmi eux ont été ensuite exposés sur chacun de nos stands, et principalement entre la France et l'Allemagne, nous sommes devenus des passeurs, comme aimait nous nommer Antoine Coron, directeur de la réserve de la Bibliothèque nationale de France. Ainsi, sur les stands de français, le public découvrit Unika T. et Dieter Wagner, ou Karim Merlin. Sur les stands allemands, l'Atelier des Grammes, Bertrand Dormy, François Réby. Il a toujours été intéressant d'observer que l'intérêt aussi bien des collègues que du public se portait particulièrement sur ces livres hors frontières, d'une conception souvent fort différente de ceux des collègues intramuros. Pourtant, les artistes du livre d'Allemagne de l'Est nous restaient encore inconnus, bien que nous aurions souhaité les inviter à participer au Salon des petits éditeurs de Mayence. Or, en juin 1989, 5 mois avant la chute du mur, nous avons eu la chance d'être conviés pour participer à l'IBA, la grande exposition internationale de l'art du livre en RDA, qui avait lieu tous les 8 ans à Leipzig. L'un de nos livres exposés, Ich habe behauptet, j'affirme, de Jürgen Beckelmann, reçut un prix. Nous avons donc obtenu un visa pour Leipzig et pu enfin découvrir l'existence de ces livres. Puis, après la chute du mur, nous avons fait connaissance de leurs éditeurs, dont Uwe Wanke, Guillermo Deisler et Ulrich Starlat. Permettez-moi d'ouvrir une parenthèse pour insister sur l'originalité de cette réunion, de cette relation entre petits éditeurs, artistes, imprimeurs de tous bords, de tout pays. Entre nous, il existe en général une fraternité véritable, une curiosité vers un autre art de faire qui transforme chaque rencontre en un moment particulièrement joyeux et enrichissant. Quant à la France, avant même le premier saga de 1986 jusqu'au marché de la poésie ou le prochain Page qui devrait nous accueillir à l'automne 2021, nous n'avons pas cessé d'y être présents, à Paris mais aussi en province, où les rencontres autour du livre d'artistes sont plus nombreuses qu'en Allemagne. Ces salons ne représentent qu'une partie de nos activités. Régulièrement, nous sommes appelés aussi à organiser des workshops. Les bibliothèques communales et départementales s'intéressant de près aux livres d'artistes et en étant des acquéreurs fidèles. À ce propos, il est intéressant de savoir que l'une des questions auxquelles j'ai dû le plus souvent répondre dans mes interventions fut pourquoi les livres d'artistes allemands sont toujours reliés, contrairement à l'ensemble des livres d'artistes français présentés en feuilles ou en album. Toutes ces activités m'incombent davantage, Johannes se consacrant essentiellement à son travail d'artiste plasticien et à la conception-réalisation des livres. Je me suis donc principalement chargée de la relation avec les artistes et éditeurs dont nous devions présenter les livres, sans oublier le public à inviter pour chacune des manifestations. Les rencontres avec les bibliothèques a aussi longtemps occupé une partie importante de mon emploi du temps. Notre contact régulier avec la BNF, la Bibliothèque nationale de France, a permis qu'en 2000, Jean-Marc Chatelain me demanda d'organiser une représentation de livres d'artistes allemands pour la rencontre à Berlin de l'Association des bibliophiles internationaux allemands. 12 collègues participèrent. Le groupe des 13+, est ainsi né, qui pendant 10 années fut invité à exposer de Tokyo à San Francisco, de Tallinn à Philadelphie. Cette aventure ne fut pratiquement réalisable que grâce à l'aide de Stefan Soltek et du musée Klingspor d'Offenbach. Puis, au début des années 2000, nos éditions prirent un nouveau tournant avec l'apparition du numérique, qui nous permettait d'élargir notre champ d'action. Ce domaine m'intéressant, il est devenu mien. J'ai pu envisager des projets impensables auparavant, en particulier dont les originaux étaient exécutés en dessin ou avec des encres diverses, scannés, adaptés sur ordinateur et imprimés avec une encre pigmentaire ultra-chrome résistante. Ces tirages peuvent compléter certains bois gravés ou devenir une œuvre en soi. Tel ce projet de Cosette de Charmois, Oracle, réalisé à partir de planches tamponnées et peintes par l'artiste, qui, une fois scannées, furent imprimées sur Epson en donnant un résultat proche de l'original sans être pour autant un facsimilé. Après cet aperçu général d'un parcours passionnant de 39 années éditoriales, il est temps que Johannes vous expose l'importance de son travail de créateur. Sans lui, les éditions Despalles n'auraient pu exister. Je lui passe la parole. Merci.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Stefan, for having invited Françoise and me to this talk and to give an overview of our work. First, I want to apologize for my poor English. My French might be better. But Stefan asked me to do this talk in English. Am I a printer? Sure not. I'm a visual artist using printing techniques, especially woodblock printing. I have done some typographical work too and made more than 25 books. I never studied printing or followed the book arts program. I've learned by doing. But how did printing get into my work? Things never come from nowhere. As a little boy in a presbytery in Switzerland, one of my jobs was to take the manuscripts of proofs of the community newsletter between the presbytery and the print shop. I was fascinated by the magic of printing and probably infected by the smell of the printing ink. This smell never left my nose, and the magic has remained in my mind. Later in high school, then as an art student, and further when I was in charge of a small family-owned company, I used to work as a designer and a kind of art director, and I've been very close to publishing and to the printing companies. By the way, I learned some basics. Letterpress was still the leading printing technique in this time. I started entering proof presses and a lot of lead and wood types in our cellar. I was spending more time collecting all this stuff than making my artwork for several years. What should I do now with all this letterpress equipment? In her French talk, Françoise had told you about our beginnings. She has explained the influence of the Mainz environment and of the Gutenberg Museum, the book fairs and the network of the book artists. She also has shown you some of the broadsides and poster poems. The first focus of Despalles prints in the specific political context of the 80s. The presses were matching for this kind of prints with woodcuts and big types. Now, let me talk now a little bit more about the books and the typography I did. Due to the technological change, bookmaking, especially in limited editions, has become a practice where artists and others were able to work and to express by their own. They didn't need any more neither a publisher's contract nor financial help. They could marry poetry to visual arts and meet authors and artists across many borders. And they can try technical and aesthetic experiments the commercial printers and publishers never could. But they are living outside of the speculation bubble of the great art. The question is, what is the real challenge for an artist and which role might they have in bookmaking? How can they deal with the content? After the first two books of poetry I printed, this question became more and more clear. The history may give an answer. There are so many great examples of artistic works to discover, from the 9th century with Rabanus Maurus, the Irish books, or the Spanish Mazarin ones, to the 20th century Dadaists and Futurists, and the contemporary visual arts, such as the German Franz Mohn, born 1926 and still living in Frankfurt. One of my goals has been to keep the same freedom of the spirit of drawing when working with letterpress and typography, to make the letters dance, just as well to use typography as a tool for an analytical approach to the text at the same time. For my first real typographical book, I chose Georg Trakls 1887 to 1914, famous poem Abendland, Evening Land. By releasing its keywords, I brought out the sensorial field. Then I tried to illustrate the mood of these words by using specific styles of typeface. I printed these words of each stanza in German and French on both sides of a tracing paper, superimposing them in another color over the words of the preceding stanza. This book, with lithographies by Robert Schwarz, was also our first bilingual book, German and French. Bilingual became Despalles' feature for the future. Some books even are conceived in 3 languages. The Artaud remains the most significant book for which I tried out the possibilities of drawing the text. The title is near unpronounceable, Maison Oine. The French actor and poet Antoine Artaud, 1896 to 1948, who has associated with the surrealism of movement, switched in his writings from French to a personal language, neither French nor a foreign tongue, a kind of musical or sound expression of mood. It is called glossolalie, the term given to this universal tongue, which has been described in the Bible as a Pentecost miracle. You might find analogous example of this kind of sound creating in the Ursonate by the German Kurt Schwitters, or in the Zaun poetry by the French Georgian artist publisher Elias, 1894 to 1975. Setting these texts is a real pleasure for the typographer, as there is a complete freedom in creating typographic shapes without any consideration for legibility. Also, there's nothing to read, but only to hear. I tried to show this by using the black rectangles of the typeset upside down. The job on this book, as on all our books, was not limited to the setting of just some text. For a year, Françoise and I have been reading a lot of Artaud's texts in order to make a choice dealing with his struggles with language and human communication. Our chosen text should be read from the beginning to the end as a continuous text. We had to make the first translation into German. In this bilingual book, the two languages are unified by the same typographical shapes, while artos glossolalis appear as a third untranslatable language. I did not limit typographical drawing exclusively to the shapes with the mixed typefaces inspired by the content, playing with the space between the letters and words. In doing this, I created another reading, new words, with stronger focus on specific words. I was guided by the idea to give the most expressive characteristic to the typography, in contrast with Howard Schwartz's geometrical style of lithography. It was working as a pedestal for Antonin Artaud. In the books that followed, I played with the spaces and tried a similar transformation of poetry into typographical shapes. I would like to mention two of them. The first one, Ziemlich Gedichtkopfkissen, Fairly Poem Below, text by the famous Austrian poet Federico Mairico, born 1924, with color etchings by the French painter Monique Friedman. First translation into French by Jacques Lajarrigue. Mairico is practicing a kind of automatic writing, associating words and meaning fields which normally are not matching up, as a surrealist did. Thus, I had to try to release visual elements from the manuscript able to be transformed into typographical shapes. In a certain way, they are illustrating the visual content of the words by the letters of these words themselves. For instance, when she writes about a photograph with double exposure and air shapes, I left more space between certain letters to create a wide gap, kind of air shapes, and then I slid the printing form to make a double printing grain black. In an analogous way, the whole text has been illustrated. At the same time, the typography is referring to the formal elements of the engraving on the opposite side. The other one, Serge Pay's Poems and Color Woodcuts by Myself. The title is L'horizon est une bouche tordue. The horizon is a bent mouth. It was the first translation of this author into German done by myself. The text of this French sound poet and performer, born 1950, have two complementary features, strong rhythm and strange images. In his readings, he performs with musical instruments, bells, Indian rain sticks, stamping his feet, and so on. He becomes breathless. She's like a shaman in a trance. When only simply reads his poems, normally said, as an unjustified text, he wouldn't have any idea of the multiple dimension of his poetry. My aim has to be to make visible the rhythm and the strangeness of the poetic images. Creating typographical shapes, I did not pay attention to the verse, but little black squares, typeset upside down, are set on the end of the verse as marks of the stamps of the performer's feet. Many of my books are hand-set and letterpress printed, but you can't apply the kind of typography I showed you to all kinds of texts. It's extremely time-consuming too. However, there have been two other reasons to try the use of the computer and scanner in our bookmaking. One, to be able to manage longer texts, and two, to directly print drawings and other artwork without using polymers. We dislike the inkjet paper. The colors are too glossy, but we no longer hesitate to use the digital media since we discovered that new archival ink printers work on Japanese paper as well as they do on arche, an uncoated French cotton paper made for printing engravings. With these machines, one is capable of printing both sides while keeping register. Now we are convinced it is a valid method to print an ink drawing with an inkjet printer. Nevertheless, I felt that I still should introduce handmade elements in the books. Season 1, text by the Lebanese American poet Etel Adnan, born in 1925, living in Paris. I combined inkjet printed drawings on one side of translucent Japanese paper with woodcuts printed by hand on the other. Because of this, there is no clear image when you turn over the pages. It changed. The text appears through the Japanese paper, each page in a different layout. It might seem to be set at random, but there's a very precise grid behind. The same fonts are moving in a kind of circle from one stanza to another, from one of the three languages, English, German, French, to the other. It corresponds with the numerous layers of these fascinating texts, changing from an everyday observation to a mythological issue, from philosophical thinkings to the celebration of California's beauty. Normally, all the artwork is made on a 1-to-1 scale. For Night, the book we made for Etel Adnan's 90th birthday, Françoise had a new idea. She enlarged one of my ink drawings. We then cut the drawing in 9 parts, matching the size of the pages and printed them by inkjet. With an enlargement of 300%, the black lines in the drawing became very soft. I assembled the parts again and made a woodcut of it, printed by hand with heavy black ink on Japanese paper. It is folded and inserted into the book as an appendix. The inkjet print evokes its own sensory feeling, but it's not comparable with the woodcut printed by hand. I like to create sensorial contrast. Let me say just a few words about a book, because its woodcuts are shown on the wall in the current Codex exhibition of the Klingspor Museum. The Chant des Morts, the Song of the Dead, cycle of poems by Pierre Roderdy, very important French poet, 1889 to 1960. For this book, I've chosen a classic typography because the text and its first German translation should be read easily. Its content is very deep. The woodcuts inside, printed by hand on both sides of Japanese paper, are paraphrasing Picasso's brush drawings of the first French edition as a painter's book by Jäger. By the way, it's in the Klingspor collection now. You've seen woodblock printing as one of my favorite techniques. The woodcuts are made on very rough but thin plywood. I like the grain and the little accidents that come with handling the tools. So the woodcuts gets an individual appearance. It can be printed easily in a proof press. More and more, I'm trying to approach my print work and book work so closely as possible to my artwork, especially to my drawing work. I'll show you 3 examples of the most recent titles, all of them with my own poems. In Interference, I superimpose the color woodcuts directly over the inkjet printed drawings. The lines of the text and the space between are referring to the drawing lines. Under the woodcut of the end papers appears a newspaper collage made by Françoise. Thus, we'll show that art and poetry, even when they are not dealing directly with political matters, are completely surrounded by them. In Der gespiegelte Schmetterlingsflug, the mirrored flight of the butterfly, the texts are handwritten with a brush and watercolor, then scanned and printed with archival ink. The texts are doubled in a simple typography on extra pages for easier reading. The color woodcuts, full page, are merely contrasting with the text. The entire book is printed on 35 grams Japanese paper. Quodlibet et is what you may call a lockdown production. While clearing up my paper shelves, I discovered a pile of an old handmade paper by Richard de Bas, very thick and very rough, fitting for etchings only. As I wouldn't deal with all the chemistry of all the etchings, I decided to work with Indian ink and watercolor on both sides of the sheets. The complete artwork should be split over the whole edition of 10. The collectors may choose the sheets they want. The 24 bilingual poems are printed on arch. These books may be the best examples of why I'm still making books. I will say artist books. The reason is my passion for poetry and visual arts. That's my personal challenge too, as a poet, as a translator, and as an artist. When I worked on my first books, I discovered how intimately you live within the text while setting it letter by letter. This emotion remains even when I'm setting it digitally. A guiding principle of my book making is the exploration of the double page, face-to-face page. As I rarely have an established type area, I like to explore the variability of the neighboring pages. Continuity, similarity, response, opposition, break, in as many ways I can. This point is always one of the essentials when I'm teaching book art. My artwork is mainly abstract. There are only a few exceptions. What can I tell about nothing? Nothing other than the sensory experience I have when the Indian ink-filled bamboo pen draws the first line on a piece of white paper, followed by other lines and curves, starting a dialogue among themselves. It becomes a mirror of the initial tension, vibrations. It is like breathing. The lines are creating a network, maybe an organic tissue. For me, the lines are like musical notes. They are working as a piece of music with its melodies, its harmonies, and the overall dynamics of its rhythm. And this is creating emotions. Nobody would ask what the music is representing or describing. The observer may be free to associate the lines with that, what they choose. But I want to avoid being locked in any interpretation outside of the aesthetic elements and the visual invention. I know that might seem to be l'art pour l'art, but it's not escapism. When we made poster poems with a political background, I understood that the message would reach only those who are like-minded. This kind of artwork is like a social ribbon in a community who identifies with the message. This is okay, but it hasn't been my goal anymore. Sure, in the recent political climate, this kind of ribbon could be useful again. But what we did once by printing is now done by social media and the internet. The question is, who may give the special role of a preacher or a messenger to an artist? For me, the artist is not a privileged person. They are simply humans and citizens like anyone else, with the same rights and the same responsibilities. When an artist is protesting against injustice or inhumanity, they should to do so as a citizen. In our book, Interference, the printed end papers with Françoise's newspaper collage and the overlying woodcut imply what I mean about the relationship between the outside world and the artist. The artist is an observer, but they have no better solutions to the problems of the world, and they can't reply to each injustice, violence, or fake news. As a human and an artist, I live with my eyes and my ears wide open in light of the distress and the horrible things happening in the world, but also for the colors and the beauty of life. All these feelings and emotions enter in my poems and in my artwork, even when it's absent. First of all, I need this labor for the health of my mind. It becomes a transcendental moment I can share through my work. It is possible to feel an ecstasy you are unable to find in the everyday life. The more the social and political events are cruel and unbearable, the more all human beings need the tonic against melancholy given by the arts and the creativity against the spirit of death, hate, and destruction. I want to be a contributor to this. I wouldn't finish this talk without my special thanks to Françoise. Without her help, I wouldn't be able to make this book how I do it today. She is a critic, the translator into French, the photographer. She's a specialist of all the computer things. Thank you.
And it was extremely nice to have you on the screen in comparison with the double pages of your books. So it was a very nice tete-a-tete and page up our page. And that told me a lot about your cosmos. And it was really a thrill to see and to learn what printing can mean attached to the field of art. And I remember Susanne Richter from Leipzig talking to us a couple of years ago, and she said, it's the artists who are going to make printing survive. And I think you gave a wonderful demonstration of that. And what I have picked up is that we are so happy and so thankful for the variety of printing. You taught us how we have to see that we can listen to pictures, that we look at sounds, that we smell the paper that makes us able to get our hands on. So we are completely full of impressions and completely full of possibilities to take benefit out of the methods of printing. I think what is so specific about your work is the wide range of printing techniques you have activated all over the years. And I was going to ask you if you have if you have a sort of a nostalgia feeling with the 80s and 90s compared to what came afterwards with the printer, but I'm afraid that that is going to cause a next long speech, and I would rather suggest that we have a lot of further questions in the chat, and maybe we come back to some of the issues of printing in your field when we have heard the next talk and get a sort of putting together aspects. And so that's my suggestion to now. Thank you very much indeed for this most impressive tour de raison. I think many of us who thought they would know your work have got the impression that they do not, and especially Françoise showing us the beginning of Éditions Despalles made a great effort in repeating the whole story of Éditions Despalles. A very important cosmos we got to know. Thank you very much for that.